So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We were doing Tafseer Surah Al'anam. So, this is Surah Al'anam. You could see right there, it says Surah Al'anam. And we went over أولئك الذين هداهم الله فبهداه مقتده. And we talked about اقتده, and if you were to stop there, and if you were to continue اقتده, or is it اقتده قل لا أسألكم عليه أجرا. But here's one thing. When we talked about قل لا أسألكم عليه أجرا, yes, it means, and say, I do not ask you for a compensation or for a reward for it. But there was one thing, as I was going over the different tafsir, there was something that Sha'rawi had mentioned. Let me just give you an idea about Sha'rawi. I absolutely love, sorry for what we're, the Sha'rawi, and I absolutely love Sha'rawi. This is basically him. All right. And what he did was a very beautiful tafsir, although it wasn't necessarily a thorough tafsir. It was, I don't know really how many videos it was, but every single surah basically has a series on YouTube, and you can actually have right now the AI basically do the translation for you and even give you the subtitles for the translation. But his tafsir is a beautiful tafsir because he relates it with our modern times. The tafsir that he had done for the whole Quran, okay, and it was also written, so you could actually find that tafsir written as well. So here it is. You can go to this website and you can find Khawatir al-Sha'rawi and actually get the translation for it as well. So you could get, I would say, perhaps maybe an 85% accuracy for his tafsirs. The tafsir that is written is actually not what he himself had written. This is it. Khawatir Muhammad Mutawalli Sha'rawi. Okay. This portion of it was actually not something that he had written. It was the videos that he had done, the different televised tafsir that he had done, and then other people basically had written the whole televised portions and basically wrote it, and it's available. So therefore, for those that would not want to watch the whole televised series, I mean, just want to get to the written format, you could actually find that right there. So Tafsir Muhammad Mutawalli Sha'rawi. Anyhow, what did I actually want to say, and why did I actually mention him right now? I was going over his tafsir, and he was talking about one portion that I didn't mention last time in regards to this ayah. قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا. And there was one thing that I never paid attention to, which was when he said, لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا, he actually went to Surah Al-Shu'ara. And he said every single prophet had said, لا أسألكم عليه أجرا. Remember, Surah Al-Shu'ara in 216 ayat was basically telling you in the beginning, Prophet Musa alayhi salam with his battle with Fir'aun and etc. And then it would basically take you from one prophet to another. The ayat are really short, absolutely beautiful surah, even though it's 216 ayat, but you could say really short ayat, but it's one of my favorite surahs. Anyhow, but one thing is that he said that Prophet Ibrahim and Prophet Musa alayhi salam were the only ones that had not said قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا. And he explains this because you want to remember the Quran is one whole. He explains this and he says, Prophet Musa alayhi salam did not say قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا because already that was, let's say, deposited before him being a prophet, when certainly he was taken as a young baby in this bassinet that was basically thrown by his mother, reaches the palace's shore, and then they would take it. And then, of course, we know the story. Okay. But then, أَلَمْ نُرَبِّكَ فِينَا وَلِيدًا, did we not raise you as a young child? And from that moment, you basically had you had been given care by us. So he said, Prophet Musa alayhi salam recognizes that Fir'aun had already invested in basically his upbringing, and therefore he cannot say قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا, because that was already paid for before. What about Prophet Ibrahim? He didn't say قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا because it would be inappropriate to tell his father لَا أَسْأَلُكَ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا, because your father contributed in your life. So therefore, your father's contribution in whatever he had done to pay for your living, for your stay, for your shelter, whatever it is inappropriate to say, well, this is what I'm paying, right now. Any service that you would do to your father or your mother, any service was already given let's say the service before you would even recognize that your parents had already given you enough service before you would even recognize it. So Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam did not say it because it would be inappropriate to tell your own father, I'm not asking you for a pay here because your father already had given you a lot more contribution than what you might actually say. So that one was a really interesting lefta, a really interesting point that I didn't mention before, that it was quite, interesting, and I didn't think about that before. And but every time you would go to the tafsir, there's this point that another scholar would unearth, which probably slipped the mind of another and a third and a fourth. And that's why it's important to go to more than one tafsir, because there are so many beautiful treasures to always find. Let's go to the other ayah. وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ إِذْ قَالُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَى بَشَرٍ مِّن شَيْءٍ. Now, here's the thing. When you look at وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, so what does that actually mean? When you look at وَمَا قَدَرُ, there are actually a number of different areas in the Quran where it actually said وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ. Let's look at those ayat. In the first surah, it's in Surah Al'anam 91, which is what we're working with. In the second time, it was in Surah Al-Zumar, and in the third time, it was in Surah Al-Hajj. Okay, well, Surah Al-Hajj actually comes before Surah Al-Zumar, but let's look at those places. So the premise, وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. Okay, this is the premise. This is the second one. وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. This is the premise. وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. This is the third premise. So why am I saying that this is a premise? Because it's telling us in the second portion of it, it's basically giving us the reason why they had not lived up to this premise. What is this premise? وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. What does that mean? قَدَرُ حَقِّ الْقَدْرِ. What does that mean? Qadaru means to give the right evaluation to something. So when haqqil qadar, to what it really deserves. Okay, so in other words, to give a taqdeer, to give the right honor, the right evaluation is to give honor. So, for example, you recognize the elderly and all the different experiences that they had lived through. So you would honor that experience by perhaps standing up for them, probably giving them leg space, probably, all of that. Maybe your parents, you recognize that they had invested so much in your life. So you basically would be there to support them, would be there to be in their service because they had given you so much in their from their end, so much in giving you all those different services. So you would honor that and recognize that. Okay, so when you say you're recognizing somebody's value, somebody's contribution, someone's honor, what does that look like? That looks like that you see what other people might not say, and you consider all the different important values that these people would embody. Okay. How do I understand حق قدر الله? قدر الله would actually mean that you would recognize the value, the honor, the magnificence, the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You would recognize it, and based on that, you put in a certain implication. You put in a certain behavior. So what does that look like? Just like when we said you honor your parents and you recognize the commitment and the services they had given to you. So the implication is that I would obey my parents, I would respect my parents, I would not parent them because they are the parents. They have a very high position. So I would basically embrace that position by showing a certain behavior, by showing a certain commitment, by showing the value and recognizing the value. I show the value of how I appreciate it. That's the same thing. When you recognize the power, the magnificence, the honor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when you're going to see a different behavior. Recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually means to put in an amount of one, honoring, believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and acknowledging his magnificence, acknowledging that he is the one to be worshipped, acknowledging within faith to recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 3, acknowledging in practice to, 1, let your own will submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. That's the other thing. So when we speak, that's obedience. That's obedience in a nutshell. Obedience is despite the fact that I have a different will, but I'm going to let my will submit to your will. Do I want this to happen? The answer is I don't want it to happen. But because I recognize your position, I recognize your value, I will basically let my will submit to your will. So that's what obedience is, by recognizing that position. So when you look at وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, that is the premise. They didn't recognize, they didn't embrace, they didn't have the vision, they didn't have the faith, they didn't have the right value to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the behavior was إِذْ قَالُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَى بَشَرٍ مِّن شَيْءٍ. The behavior, the result of that, they said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not reveal anything onto any human being. So what did they deny? Well, they denied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words. Let's see. وَمَا قَدْرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. In the second one, they did not embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the premise, and the same wording. But وَالْأَرْضُ جَمِيعًا قَبْضَتُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَالسَّمَوَاتُ مَطْوِيَّاتٌ بِيَمِينِهِ. What happened? Well, is it necessarily just an application? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this one, he basically said, well, they didn't recognize that on Judgment Day, that everything on the earth is basically within his grip. Everything on Judgment Day is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grip. Everything would be, the heavens, the earth is all basically folded in the grip of the Lord Almighty, and nothing can escape Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. So what does that mean? When you look at وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, sometimes the ayat would tell us the implication of what that means, of how they did not recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. In other times, it will say, وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, and why they were supposed to recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, in other words, why they should have actually recognized and why they didn't recognize and what they're missing out in the actual vision. And that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power is encompassing all, that the earth and the heavens would be in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grip. When you look at al-qabda, what is al-qabda? Al-qabda is actually the grip. The grip meaning your hand, you've got everything in your palm, you put it inside, and that's basically you encompassing everything in a grip. In other words, it's the power. So whether we're speaking about resembling, metaphorical, or whether we're speaking about literally, as the Ahl al-Hadith would like to use, they would like to say, no, we're talking about literal here. Al-Asha'ira would basically like to explain this as a metaphorical thing, okay? But I don't want to get into that. At the end, it's embracing the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do I embrace the actual vision, the actual value of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Number one is that we would recognize how everything falls way smaller and way less than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we would embrace the word Allahu Akbar. That's the first thing. Then, Inna Allah qawiyyun aziz, that the Lord Almighty is almighty and aziz. What is aziz? Aziz means self-efficient. In other words, وَمَا قَدَرَ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. It's in order for us to understand that this universe is not only in the grip of the Lord Almighty, but the Lord Almighty is qawi. So the whole idea, the whole premise of what it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taqdeer azamatillah, and to really embrace the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to really understand these two words. Inna Allah qawiyyun aziz. The Lord Almighty is almighty, and therefore you are living al-ubudiyya. You're living the submission to the Lord Almighty. Al-Aziz, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is self-efficient, and therefore when you compare the two, which two? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qawi aziz, then that actually means you're the opposite of that. الإنسان خلق ضعيفا. Human beings were created in weakness. And human beings, are they aziz? No. Are they self-efficient? No. They're actually in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الإنسان خلق في كبد. الإنسان was created in different hardships. Al-insan is in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they basically were, one, they needed the rizq, they needed life, they were given, they need life, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives rizq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives the power, Allah, the shifa. Everything is basically dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how do I live وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ? That's for the kuffar. How do I, as a believer, live قَدَرْتُ حَقَّ قَدْرِ اللَّهِ? How do I live that? I live it by, number one, in terms of aqeedah, understanding the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the number one. That's the first thing. Number two, if I want to really embrace that in terms of faith as well, how do I see it? Sometimes it's hard for me to understand Asma Allah, al-Asma, and the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fair enough. Then there are other details within the Quran or the Sunnah that may give you further demonstration to fully understand the names and attributes and how they unfold in practice. And this is basically how it unfolds in practice, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically having everything, the future, the past, the forces, the energy, the life, the death, everything is basically in the grip in the grip of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing goes outside the grip of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, what else? Well, the other part is basically to recognize al-wahi, that your epistemology, recognize in practice, yes, this is aqidah, but in practice, you would basically embrace what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed onto the prophets. So when I say qadara haqqi qadrillah, it actually means to, one, believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is al-Qawi al-Aziz, and that you are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that your life, when you look at al-ibadah, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create us to worship Him? Is He going to get anything out of our worship? No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to get anything out of your worship. So why did He ask us to worship Him? Because you need it. Wait, how am I going to need that worship? How is it that I'm going to need that worship and it's for my sake? When you need water, does the water need you? The water doesn't need you, but you need water. Okay? You need water. The water doesn't need you. The water is not going to benefit anything when you drink it. The water is just going to go into the cycle of water. That's it. The water doesn't need you, but you need the water. What does that make you? That makes you life. That makes you weak, needing to survive on water and hydration. Now, the other thing is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is not in need for your ibadah, because in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ had said in the hadith Qudusi. What is a hadith Qudusi? A hadith Qudusi is basically a hadith that it's the wording that the Prophet ﷺ had quoted of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not a Quran. Okay? It's not a Quran. What did He say? لو أن أولكم وآخركم وإنسكم وجنكم. If all the people, the ones that had come first and the ones that came last and the ones that had lived throughout history and all of that, and the ones, every single one was at the heart and the faith and the submission as the best submission and the best of integrity and religious integrity, as the best one from the ins and jinn, that would not add anything to the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the same time, if all the humanity and all the jinn and all the humans would be at the worst heart and the worst behavior and the worst of the worst from the ins and the jinn, that would not decrease anything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. So what are we getting to right there? It's basically telling us that al-ibadah is for your sake. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within you this desire, this need for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's part of your own instinct. It's part of your own fitrah. Just as your body is in need of water, for example, your soul is in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for spiritual recognition, for a spiritual enhancement. So therefore, when you look at Inna Allah Qawiyyun Aziz, in order to understand وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, it is also part of you understanding who you truly are. You are daif. You are in need of Allah. You are under the power and the complete encompassment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. You have nowhere to run. You have nowhere to hide. You're in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qabda. You're in His grip. Therefore, how do I put that into practice? The kuffar were saying, مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَى بَشَرٍ مِّن شَيْءٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not reveal anything. In practice, a believer would say, I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu Muhammad Rasulullah. I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had delivered the message that contained الإيمان, and that also contained العمل الصالح in practice and how I would submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically what we would embrace in terms of قدر حق الله سبحانه وتعالى. Okay, now the other part. إذ قالوا ما أنزل الله على بشر من شيء. That's the portion that we did. Okay. قل من أنزل الكتاب الذي جاء به موسى نورا وهدى للناس تجعلونه قراطيس تبدونها وتخفون كثيرا. Let's see what here. Al-Qurtubi actually went in some details about that one, because it's saying who then say who's the one that delivered the book that was sent onto Prophet Musa that contained the light and the guidance to people. You would make some of it as written, basically manuscripts. You would reveal some of it and you would conceal most of it. And you were taught what you had not known, not you and not your fathers, your ancestors, that is. Then say Allah. Then let them basically, it's like just disregard them in their play, to engage in their play, basically. But let's look at a couple things. When you look at this ayah, what's the story? What's the context? Is this actually revealed in Medina, or was this revealed in Mecca? What is the story? Why did he bring up Prophet Musa alayhi salam in the context within this ayah? So let's say what this ayah, what al-Qurtubi and other mufassirin had said about this ayah. Let's say, so the first portion said, وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. In other words, they did not embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what is possible on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Ibn Abbas had said, well, they didn't believe what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of doing. Al-Hasan had said, well, that means they did not regard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's magnificence to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really resembles in magnificence. And they said, and he said that the وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, that, well, by saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not revealed anything onto any human being is in itself not embracing the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. There is actually, let's see, Abu Ubaidah, and we're going to talk about some stories right there because there are certain contexts. Abu Ubaidah had said, well, this is actually talking about that they didn't really know Allah. Okay, it's quite interesting because even in Nahas had basically said, هذا معنى حسن. That's actually a good interpretation. Why? Because it's important for us. How do we recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do we recognize the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? But that is impossible unless you take the time to learn the names and attributes, unless you take the time to relate with the scripture, because the scripture itself is going to give you the details of what you as a human being cannot have access to knowing. How not? Why can't I have access to knowing this information? What the scripture is going to tell you is how to use your intelligence, your heart, your ruh, your soul, to seeing beyond the materialistic things and actually see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's magnificence. That's ma'rifatullah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If the person is busy using different methods to probably just understand the world and just understand how to get a better job, how to basically understand human behavior, whatever it is, all these different things, then that's مبلغهم من العلم. All they know is a very surfaced amount of knowledge and understanding. a surfaced amount of knowledge and understanding about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because in that situation, they didn't really learn about Allah. They just learned about what makes their life easier and not necessarily about what really is considered as the main force behind this universe, behind this world, behind life, behind what made life even possible, the purpose of life. So Abu Ubaidah is one of those scholars that, inshallah, one day we'll actually talk about him in details. But I would say he's one of these very intelligent scholars, and he actually wrote about money. It's quite interesting that he wrote about tafsir and wrote about, in fact, his book is actually called Al-Amwal. It's in almost, almost 800, 900 pages, but he just talks about money. And it's not just talking about money for the sake of talking about money and how to make money and all of that. No, but he looks at money and how to basically present justice through money and how to relate to worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through money. Okay, we're not going to get into that. But he said, so how do I know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? As a Muslim, when you say to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does that actually mean? How do I know Allah? You would know Allah through a couple things. Number one, you would know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through learning the scripture itself, learning the Quran. That's number one. Number two, you would know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through al-ibadah itself. Wait a minute, how do you learn about Allah through al-ibadah? Because remember when we talked about al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, and he was saying that you would not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless you invest a certain amount of time to worship Allah, because the moment that you submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will let you see your weakness, your ibadah, your submission to him, and that's how you would recognize your power. When you take that time to take away and, let's say, eliminate the different distractions in this world, that's when you'll be given the focus. When you eliminate the distractions, that's how you're going to get the focus. But as long as those distractions are there, there's absolutely no way that you're going to get a level of focus. In order to get that level of focus, you have to focus on what? You have to focus on 1, al-Quran, 2, al-ibadah, 3, al-ilm, knowledge. There's no way that you can know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you don't take the time to learn about Allah, to learn about his orders, to learn about how to relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So learning Islam is one way to learning about Allah and having this qadr Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and learning about qadr Allah, learning about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These 3 things. But it's not enough to have the ilm. You have to have the ibadah, a portion of ibadah as well. It's not enough to have a portion of ibadah, but you also have to have a portion of dhikr. You have to have a portion where you would contemplate in recognizing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said about you and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about himself. Okay, let's see. And I love in Nahas that he said, وَهَذَا مَعْنًا حَسَنًا. It's a beautiful definition. It's a beautiful explanation. Why? He said, because when you say قَدَرْتُ الشَّيْءَ وَقَدَّرْتُهُ, that actually means I had known its value. I had recognized its value, and that's what we would basically recognize through the scripture. Now I want you to look at this one. When he said, وَمَا قَدْرُ اللَّهِ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ إِذْ قَالُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَى بَشَرٍ مِّن شَيْءٍ, you would say, well, wait a minute, how's that even relevant? Because if you don't recognize the scripture, if you don't recognize what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, then there's no way that you are going to be capable of recognizing who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, because your intelligence is limited to understanding, to probably researching or probably dissecting or whatever it is, the different things that are materialistic. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond matter. Your brain was only capable of understanding and studying or probably researching or probably experimenting on matter. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond matter. The only way to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to basically go through the revelation, through the Quran, in order to know who Allah is and how to know Allah and how to submit to Allah. That's the only way. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends the prophets and the messengers in order for the people to recognize the value and who and the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But only until then is the person capable of getting to that conclusion about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if the person did not have access, did not learn what the prophets and the messengers were basically what they were informing the people about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's absolutely no way that they were going to be capable of understanding the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their own intelligence is not going to be enough to give them this insight to see and recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, now the other piece, when you look at إِذْ قَالُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَى بَشَرٍ, what? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not reveal anything anything to any human being. Ibn Abbas, they said, well, this was actually referring to the different people in Mecca, the pagans, basically. But here's one thing. For the scholars that said that this was directed at the people of Quraysh, the objection was, well, they didn't believe in what was sent unto Prophet Musa. So they responded and said, well, certainly they didn't believe what was sent unto Prophet Musa, but they had already known that there were these sects, these religious groups that had previously said that there was a revelation that was sent in the past. So they recognized, in other words, that there was a pattern, that historically this was something that happened before, even if they didn't believe in it. The other scholars, they said, like Al-Hasan and Sa'id ibn Jubayr, they said, well, no, there was actually a context. It was a story to this revelation for this ayah, and that was Malik ibn Sayf. And other scholars actually said his name was Finhas, whatever the name was. It doesn't really matter what the name was. Is that there was this Jewish figure that he came to debate with the Prophet ﷺ, and then he basically said, I ask you by the one that sent the Torah on Prophet Musa, do you find anything in the Torah that said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes the rabbis that are obese or overweight? But here's one thing. Malik ibn Sayf, that was his name, he was a Jewish rabbi, okay? He basically comes to the Prophet ﷺ in order to debate the Prophet ﷺ and tell him, well, there's nothing of what you were saying. There was nothing of nothing of you being mentioned in the Torah, nothing of any prophecy of that sort. You were just basically an imposter, blah, blah, blah. So that's basically what he had come to say. So then the Prophet ﷺ wants to expose the discrepancy of what he was saying and plus the life that he was living in. What was that? So he himself was actually an obese or a fat rabbi, even though the Torah itself, according to this story, the Torah itself was saying that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes fat or obese rabbis. In other words, was he actually living the lifestyle that the Torah itself was teaching? So the Prophet ﷺ wanted to expose that he wasn't actually applying the words himself. That's when the rabbi then said, well, no, there was nothing of that sort. Nothing was revealed as exposing fat rabbis. So he basically wanted to deny the scripture itself. Then that's what basically was later revealed, that you would conceal some of it, you would hide others. But then in other stories, it basically said that this Malik ibn Saif, when he was confronted by his people, that why did you say that it doesn't exist when you already know that it exists? And he said, well, I cannot here face the fact that I had hidden something from the scripture. But here's one thing, is that this story, although mentioned in the books of Tafsir, but the books of Tafsir also, although mention the story, but the books of Tafsir not always would necessarily contain all the information or even the stories that may necessarily be authentic. And here's one thing. So to search for that, this website is an outstanding website. They had done thorough investigations and thorough studies in different things, and would basically make the story short. That way I won't have to search all the different books to see whether that is actually authentic or not. And they had mentioned that this story is, number one, they said, لم نقف على أصل هذه الرواية. We don't have any evidence to support that this narration was authentic. Samarqandi had said that this was actually a fabricated story. Al-Dhahabi himself in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala had also mentioned that this was actually not a story that traces back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. And there was one thing, is that it was mentioned that it had a non-authentic narration according to some scholars, and that would be mursal. In other words, it has a broken narrator, chain of narration, but not necessarily as a fabricated story. Okay, but here's one thing. When you look at all of that, telling you that isnad da'if, and the reason for that is this figure within that chain of narration, all of that, of course, you would want to say that that this hadith is actually not authentic. But just because it's not authentic, it doesn't mean that being obese is a good thing. There's nothing that says that being obese is a good thing. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ had talked about obesity and had talked about how bid'ah it is to overeat, to excessive eating, and all of that, and the impact it has, all of that. Now, but that's a completely different thing. So just because the Prophet ﷺ had talked about obesity and talked about overeating as not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would approve of or Islam would approve of, that doesn't necessarily mean we would regard this narration as authentic. All right, that's a completely different thing, because when we look at this narration, we're looking at that particular narration and not the theme. The theme itself is not what we would use in order to validate a certain piece of information or disregard it. Just because it sounds nice, it sounds basically giving us a nice story or this nice theme, it doesn't mean that we're just going to validate it because of so. Let's see. And I want you to see right there, there was that it was actually mentioned in Asbab al-Nuzul lil-Wahidi. let me tell you an idea, just give you an idea about أسباب النزول الواحدي. أسباب النزول الواحدي, it's not a big book, really. It's to almost 200 pages, but most of أسباب النزول الواحدي was actually included in the tafsir. So you would see it in the footnotes right there, and basically make the story short for you, would basically be as, as an appendix to a lot of the books of tafsir. Okay, now, but أسباب النزول الواحدي, certainly الواحدي wanted to find out some of those stories that we would know that were perhaps the reason why a certain ayah was revealed. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily know the context of each and every single ayah. Okay, so he might have mentioned this story, but he didn't say that I'm going to mention only the authentic stories. He's just telling you of what he was capable of tracing in what was mentioned, and he would basically include it within Asbab al-Nuzul. But not everything that is in Asbab al-Nuzul lil-Wahidi, not everything is necessarily authentic, but it was a story mentioned. Is this story authentic? Is this not authentic? That's different research. Okay, let's see. And of course, those that had said, those that had said, well, that's not the reason for the revelation, or at least they basically had objected. They said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was asking, well, who's the one that revealed the book that was, who was the one that revealed the book that was sent unto Prophet Musa containing the light and the guidance, but then you would make those written things and you would hide some things, you would expose some things. Okay, they said, well, this was actually this was exposing the Yahud in the Jews because they wanted to hide the different prophecies about the Prophet ﷺ that was actually in their scripture. In other words, the reason why this ayah was revealed, they said it was directed at the Yahud, regardless of whether it was Malik ibn Saif or whether it was Ka'b al-Ashraf, regardless of who it was basically dealing with a society, the Jewish society, who basically had claimed that they did not have any evidence or any prophecy about a coming prophet, even though they were bragging to the pagan Arab in Medina at the time. It was Yathrib, and they were telling them that there was a coming prophet. This coming prophet, we're going to basically join with him. He's going to be part of us, and we're going to bring basically a complete elimination to your pagan presence, to your presence, basically the Arab, the Aus al-Khazraj, and we're basically going to defeat you all, and we're going to be in power. And well, those pieces of prophecies is what actually guided the Aus and al-Khazraj to later believe in the Prophet ﷺ, because they said, well, we used to hear you speak about the prophecy, and here is the prophet that you had foretold us about. But here's one thing. You know, some scholars actually, in that debate, I don't want to get into that one. So whether it was sent to the people of Quraysh or whether it was sent to the Yahud, at the end, you would see that the ayah responds and says, هذا كتاب أنزلناه مبارك مصدق الذي بين يديه ولتنذر القرى ومن حولها. I want you to look at this one, that this is a book that was revealed, a blessed book that was revealed, confirming what was revealed in the past, and it is to warn القرى. So the scholars that said that that was revealed in response and an objection to what the people of Quraysh were saying, that there is some truth to that, because it was saying, well, it was to warn the people in Mecca, which is al-Qura. What does the word al-Qura mean? The word al-Qura actually means the mother of the cities. So whether this was in a word that was like a known word, it was a nickname for Mecca, or whether it was a description, al-Qura, that's the main city, that's the center city, and then all the different cities that surround it. So regardless of whether this was a response to the people of Quraysh or whether it was a response to all the different cities that would basically be surrounding Mecca, whether we're speaking about a city in Baghdad or a city in probably Morocco or a city in the US or whatever it is, it would still be considered a surrounding city. In other words, it was to all mankind. That is, this is a revelation to object to whatever the people in Mecca were worshiping, or even all those different claims in other cities were basically claiming. Let's see. And of course, when you look at the qira'ah, يَجْعَلُونَهُ قَرَاطِيسِ, this sentence would bring it يَجْعَلُونَهُ, that they were making it. They were basically writing it, and this is bringing it as a third person. يَجْعَلُونَهُ, they were doing it. In another qira'ah, though, it was actually saying it تَجْعَلُونَهُ, a direct speech, that's what you were doing. You would make it, you would write it down on these manuscripts, but then, in other words, it's a direct second person. Okay, so regardless of the first qira'ah, يَجْعَلُونَهُ, or the second qira'ah, يَجْعَلُونَهُ, talking about them, okay, regardless of that, at the end, we can basically say that it was directed at al-Qura and all the other nations, so making that qira'ah تجعلونه and يجعلونه would basically be inclusive to all the different nations that basically objected the Prophet ﷺ, whether we're talking about the Yahud or whether we're speaking about the people in Quraysh. And in other words, at the end, even the people of Quraysh, they had heard about the prophecies that in the revelation that was sent onto Prophet Musa, and that they basically had wanted to conceal some of it and wanted to reveal some of it. All right, let's see. The other part, there was something that was interesting, that some scholars, based on this ayah, تَجْعَلُونَهُ قَرَاطِيسَ تُبْدُونَهَا وَتُخْفُونَ كَثِيرًا. Some scholars, based on that, they said it is disliked that we would make Quran into portions. What does that mean? The different Quran portions that you would have, para or juz'u 1, juz'u 2, or para 1, para 2, whatever it is, these ajza, and would be in 30 juz'u, or some of them would be just having probably Surah Yasin, Surah Al-Kahf, and maybe a couple other surahs. Some scholars actually consider that that's disliked and said that that fits within this description, that you would make it into manuscripts or written books, basically containing some that is a portion that you would reveal and the other portions you would conceal, and regarded that to not fit this description, we would have to always have the whole Quran within it. In other words, if any of the pages are ripped, you want to basically not use this Quran, according to that, according to basically those scholars. But that's not something that all scholars would agree on, because there's a difference with the intention. So if I am taking, let's say, maybe just Juz'u 30, for example, Juz'u Amma, and I'm just working on that, in order not to carry the whole book, I'm just working on this juz'u and basically just memorizing this juz'u, or working and studying this juz'u, etc. So we just use it in that portion. That doesn't mean I'm denying the other portions. So it's not necessarily that I'm hiding the other portions. It's that I would I would basically contain all the Quran, but at this moment, I'm just studying this portion of it. Because certainly we're not going to be capable of studying everything all at once. So, just wanting to comment on that one. Right. So when the sister is basically saying, but our intention is different when we divide the Quran, it's to understand it better. Well, yes, I'm not saying do not divide it. And I'm actually saying that some scholars hated that, but that the majority of the scholars had considered that, no, looking at the intention is important, and that just because this ayah is saying this, that doesn't mean that dividing the Quran into paras or portions is necessarily wrong, because the intention and the object is completely different. So when this ayah was scolding them تبدونها وتخفون كثيرا, it was scolding them for denying the fact that it exists in the Quran, or at least in their scripture. Okay, so that's the part. So in other words, let's say somebody, if we were to put it into practice, someone said, yes, I believe in the Quran, but the part about polygamy is something that I don't believe in. Or the part about hijab is not something that I feel comfortable with. Or the part about inheritance is not something that I feel is fair. That's kufr on the spot. Okay? That's kufr on the spot. Because you had embraced some of it and then you disregarded the rest, then that's basically going to be the actual application of this. You revealed some of it, but then you disregarded the other. But as a Muslim, you are to take the whole thing, whatever you might be comfortable with and whatever you may not be comfortable with. Wait, there's such a thing? Comfortable and not, of course, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. You were obligated to fight, engage in jihad, even though it is detested on you. You would hate it. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had obligated or had forbid certain things that may sometimes be hard for you to fully embrace, and you feel that it's not easy for me, that, for example, my husband would get married to a second wife, or me putting on a hijab, it's too hot, or me probably accepting that even though my brothers, they're nothing but brats, but they're the ones that are getting double the inheritance of me. They're not the ones that helped my mother and father. They're not the ones that were nice to my mother and father, but I still have to accept it. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم خلاص آمنا. That's it. سمعنا وأطعنا. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said something, I'm going to take that as what is justice, as what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as the truth, and I'm not going to conceal something just because I may not be comfortable with it, and just because it is something that probably within my context may not seem fair. Okay. قل الله. Say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is that? قل الله أي قل يا محمد. Say, let's say, قل من أنزل الكتاب الذي جاء به موسى نورا وهدى تجعلونه قراطيس. Then here قل الله. قل الله, sorry, not قل الله, but قل الله. So say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in other words, what the Prophet ﷺ was ordered to do is to basically object to them and say, well, if you say otherwise, let me educate you on this. That's a key thing. What was he saying? Let me educate you on who really revealed all of this. It was Allah. ثُمَّ ذَرْهُمْ. Then let them basically, the word ذَرْهُمْ, I want to look at this one. Let me erase all of this first. That way we can expose, just the piece that we are working on. Okay. ثُمَّ ذَرْهُمْ. Here's the word ذَرْهُمْ. What is ذَرْ? We talked about this before. We said الذر can mean ants. الذر can mean the little tiny particles in the air. الذر can also mean dust. Okay. And ذرهم, the pronoun ذرهم, actually means to disregard. Okay. How do you disregard? I mean, is it an ant? Is it this? The same way that the little tiny particles, they're in the air, they're dust in the air that you may not realize, etc. But then these little tiny particles in the air, they're disregarded. They don't even carry any weight. They're just flying up and just roaming around in the air. You don't even recognize it. You don't even see it. Unless there was, I guess, a light or a ray that makes you see all of that. That's the only time that you recognize that it's actually there. That's a dha. Okay. So when you look at dharhum, it's disregarding it as if it doesn't exist. In other words, don't let that be your focus. Don't let them be your focus, even when they may say things that are against the religion. You would say your pace. You would be the one that comes in to educate them. And don't let them be the ones that are making the loud noise. Because the second that they would be making the loud noise, yes, certainly that loud noise may sometimes be a distractor, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, don't let that noise that they are making in al-la'ib. When children play, what are they doing? You're hearing loud sounds of children running, children basically screaming. Others are, screaming of joy. Others screaming of anger. Others screaming because they're crying. They lost their toy or whatever it is. That's al-la'ib. Al-la'ib is to not take something seriously. Okay. But al-khawd is to get into water. That's al-khawd. Wait, so get into water? When you get into water, that's al-khawd. You get into water, and with this, let's say, while you're going into the water, what do you see? You feel this heaviness, but then, of course, when you get into the water, you start not realizing the world around you. You can't hear right. You're getting into the water and the world around you, once you sink into the water, of course, the water basically would stop all the wave, the vibration, and then you're not going to be able to hear everything. Okay. And then la'ib, it's all that screaming, all that they're basically making all that noise, that not taking anything seriously. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ذَرْهُمْ فِي خَوْضِهِمْ يَلْعَبُونَ, it was in order to tell you that this type of play, this type of not taking any of the words of the scripture seriously, and they would be just engaging in this type of talk, like they won't even hear what you're saying. They're in this khawd, they're just engaging in it, just like people would engage in water. They're just playing in water, and it's making all this white noise, and they're not even listening. They're not even hearing what you're saying. When you said, it's Allah, they're not even hearing you. And this is important, that you would recognize that not because people are making a louder noise against the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it does not make them on speaking of truth. Just because they are making louder noise, just because they are doing that al-khawd, just because they're getting into this type of going into this area and making all that white noise and making all that vibration or not vibration, but all that hold in trying to distract themselves from what you are saying. It doesn't make it necessarily right. And then, Qulillah, you have to announce and be determined and stand your ground. This is important. Stand your ground even when others are lacking seriousness in how they interact with one another, how they interact and relate with the world around them. And then, وَهَذَا كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ مُبَارَكٌ مُصَدِّقُ الَّذِي بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ وَلِتُنذِرَ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا. Yet, you recognize your source of information, your epistemology, your place and resources that basically help you see the truth. And this is a very important thing to study. A lot of those that would get into psychology, they don't study philosophy. And sorry, ladies, I'm going to get off track for just a little bit. You know, a lot of those that would study psychology, philosophy is not, or epistemology in particular, is actually not part of the courses that they would actually take. Why is epistemology important? Epistemology, it scrutinizes the resources that you're going through and that you're depending on, especially in your interpretation. When you made this or that interpretation, is that within the arena of one, speculation, or is that containing any basis, or where is it actually coming from? Or is that based on your emotions, and is that based on ilm? What kind of ilm? Is it empirical? Is it doubt? Is it scripture? Where is it coming from? And this is extremely important. When we see a lot of those Muslim students, they would go into, especially the Department of Humanities, that when they don't study epistemology, they end up not knowing how to sift between interpretation A and interpretation B, and not know the philosophies that are actually backing up or motivating certain interpretations. They end up taking it without scrutinizing what is the origin of such an interpretation, when a lot of those interpretations are actually backed up by liberal interpretations, or perhaps interpretations that are atheistic but are presented as if it was actually knowledge, and presented as if this was the final thing, and as if it is the actual experiment and what it is actually saying, when no, not necessarily. A lot of these interpretations are induced to say a certain conclusion because it was paid for by certain groups and by certain agendas. It was paid for, let's say, the atheist group, the feminist group, the LGBT or whatever, and then they paid to make a research that would support, let's say, a certain conclusion. And then certainly, since you paid me to do that, well, I'm going to basically create a study, quote unquote, that would support what you had paid for. 95% of the studies, or the so-called studies, are actually sponsored by certain groups, and the sponsorers are going to determine the conclusion and the results of what that quote-unquote study is basically saying. And then many of these students don't know how to go over these studies and how to scrutinize. The word is scrutinize. Just underline this word, because it's important to put that interpretation under the microscope. And I don't mean that literally, but I mean to make a thorough investigation where and what is actually backing up such a result and such a conclusion, and why did they actually say that. And for a Muslim to help you be free from such agendas and from such influences, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically sent you the scripture, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught you need to use two lenses. Al-Huda basically is the glasses. It's basically containing two different lenses, Al-Quran and the Sunnah. If it is going against the Quran and the Sunnah, then you're going to know right there that that was basically something that others had put in front of your face and blocked your vision to see the reality. So, وَهَذَا كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ مُبَارَكٌ. This Quran, this book, was actually revealed, أنزلنا, sent down. And remember yesterday when we talked about sending down, and we said sending down, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sorry about that, please. But sorry, something just, I've never seen this creature in America. I only see it here in Malaysia. But anyhow, I stepped on it, and here it is. And here we go. It's actually a pretty small one, but these things actually swim on water. They literally swim on water. And they also fly. I don't know how they could do the same, but they fly and swim on water. These creatures, I had only seen them only in Malaysia. And they have these, I don't know, they look like a helicopter that with four different antennas, whatever. Okay, where were we? That was a little ad. Sorry about that. Come to Malaysia. Okay, here we go. What were we saying? La ilaha illallah. That was a real big distraction. Okay. I guess we'll just start. وهذا كتاب أنزلناه مبارك مصدق الذي بين يديه. Okay, so the Quran basically announces that in order to really find the truth, this is kitab. Al-kitab basically means a book. Okay, أنزلناه, and we were talking about, that's where it left off. We were talking about yesterday about the word nazala and nazzala and anzala. What's the difference? When you say قرأ سورة القدر, إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر. إنا أنزلناه, not نزلناه, أنزلناه. What's the difference? When you have this alif, أنزل, that basically is called the ta'diyah. What does that look like? And what does that even mean? So when you say أنزلناه, that would basically talk about the transmission from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Jibreel alayhi salam. That's the transmission. And then when you're talking about the second transmission from as-samawat to al-ard, that's usually going to be nazzalnahu. So when you look at anzalnahu, it's basically speaking about the transmission, the first transmission from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Jibreel alayhi salam. Okay, but nazzalahu or nazzalnahu would be talking about mainly from Jibreel alayhi salam to the Prophet sallam. In other words, that's the second process. So when here kitabun anzalnahu, that it was talking about the beginning of it, the first transmission from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Jibreel alayhi salam. Mubarak. It was Mubarak. Wait a minute. So what is Mubarak anyways? Mubarak means it is blessed. What does blessed meaning? When something is blessed, it basically has, think of it as a condensed thing, but the good within it is multiplied. It's abundant. So it could be, kind of like when you say you had, let's say, a pill this pill might actually be 100 milligrams or whatever it is, okay? But then its power is basically probably stronger than perhaps another pill, which only has 5 milligrams, okay? But the power in it is basically less, okay? So when you look at Mubarak, it's to say that although it's a small portion, it's in 604 pages, the Quran is just in 604 pages, although it's a small portion, but the benefit and the knowledge and the abundance of information within it is actually Mubarak. It's actually blessed. It's abundant. It's unlimited to how much of information and wisdom that you can derive from it. That's al-Mubarak. Yes, it's a small portion, but there's so much benefit. The benefit in it is more than what you can count. مصدق الذي بين يديه. Okay, let's say, what is مصدق? مصدق الذي بين يديه ولتنذر القرى ومن حولها. Okay, you know what? Why didn't we talk about this one? يجعلونه نورا وهدى فيكون الصلاة. Okay, no, we're going to skip that piece of it. Okay. Okay. هذا كتاب. What is it referring to? He said this is referring, هذا كتاب, this is referring to the Quran. أنزلناه مبارك. Then in other words, it basically has al-barakah and even the abundance of al-barakah. And what does it do? What does it have? مصدق الذي بين يديه. It would confirm what was revealed onto the previous scriptures. Well, what is it? What was revealed? Are we talking about the details? No, we're talking about proving the oneness of the Lord Almighty and proving the objection to shirk and basically to shirk. وَلِتُنذِرَ الْقُرَى, and to warn Mecca, and al-Qura is basically the other name for it, and وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا. In other words, this is revealed to bring about an abundance of information, an abundance of good, and to also bring a warning. Wait a minute. So to also, is that what you said? Yes. So what is the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran? Number one is basically, أنزلناه مبارك. It's to bring barakah, to bring all the good within basically society. In other words, it is to guide in good, in righteousness, to bring the best of humanity, to bring the best of understanding, to bring the best of everything. That's Mubarak, the best of everything. وَلِتُنذِرَ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا, and to bring a warning. So in other words, to do what? It's to bring the best of everything, to bring the best, whether it's your effort to help you bring the best of your effort to put it in place, or whether it's to bring the best of the society and to basically channel it to what basically brings the best of benefit to it, or whether it is to bring the best of economy, the best of society, the best of health, the best of wealth, the best in all of those different things. And that's basically bringing in the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the heavens, in order to mirror and to help people recognize how they can channel the different things that surround them in a way to bring the best to the society. But that's not enough, because it is also through channeling all their efforts and all the different good things, that's basically to also bring it to the purpose that preceded their existence, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it was to warn them and the different cities. Warn them of what? Warn them of Judgment Day. Warn them that they were created to be tested, and that their efforts and what they were given was going to be something that they will be asked about. That's in the Arab. Okay. وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ. How did we get into this sentence? How did we get into from speaking about the reason for revelation and then this doing this iltifat type of thing that in English language, in English grammar, this is incoherent. In Arabic, this is not incoherent. And when you want to judge a language, one thing is that a lot of the Orientalists, when they, of course, their Arabic was not as Arab, so they would basically look at the sentence and they would say, well, this is not coherent. How did the structure of the sentence go from one person to second person to third person later on and to actually get into a different subject? And they would consider that, oh yeah, this is not coherent. But in Lugha Arabiya, this is coherent. So when it said, and jump to, let's say, the other sentence and said, and for those that would believe in the hereafter, they would believe in it, and those that would be committed on their salah and they would preserve it, what about them? Is it لِتُنذِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى plus those that surround it, and plus those that would believe in Allah, those that would believe in Judgment Day, and those that would believe in it, and they would be preserving their prayer? Is it to warn all of these people? But wait a minute, those that would be in belief, why did they need to be warned? Why did they need to be warned if they're really believing in it? It's to basically bring in a commitment that is determination that would stay for as long as they can, for as long as they live, basically. Okay, so now we understand وَلِتُنذِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا وَالَّذِينَ and plus الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ. The other interpretation is that لِتُنذِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا, it is to warn the people of al-Qura, Mecca, and those that are around it, and for those that would believe in Judgment Day and believe in the scripture that is the Quran, they would be committed to their prayer. In other words, what do we get out of this one? We would get that those that did not believe in the scripture, based on that other interpretation, those that did not believe in the scripture, they would lose out on the barakah, on the benefit of what they would be getting in terms of the effort, the social, the economic, whatever it is, all these different things. They would not get the barakah. They would not get the good out of all of that. In other words, it would be an effort that basically gets lost. Remember yesterday when we talked about وَالْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ يَرْفَعُ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would elevate the good effort. That good effort would basically come in to basically pay you back. In other words, whatever wrong thing that you would do, it will come back to you. And whatever good thing that you would do, it would also come back to you. But the good thing that would come back to you would go beyond time. We were talking about that yesterday. It would go beyond time, where the good would basically bring in a good result beyond your life, because it would be in the hereafter as well. Okay. Yet when we look at those that are not believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their efforts would not be mubarakah. It would become in basically complete loss. It would vanish. All that effort would vanish in bringing in the good effect to them. It wouldn't be mubarak. But wait a minute, how is it that you're talking about human action and human effort when it was actually talking about al-kitab? Right, it was talking about al-kitab, but what does the kitab contain? It is mubarak. Yes, the book itself contains a lot of wisdom that is to be applied in people's life to bring barakah in their life. Okay, So it is Mubarak, it is full of wisdom and endless wisdom within it. And this endless wisdom within it is to basically bring barakah in your life. That's why he said Mubarak, that it is blessed to bring you blessings. And وَلِتُنذِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا, and to bring in the warning for those people. Now, here's the thing. When it said وَلِتُنذِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا, to basically warn these people, but then it jumped وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ, and those that would believe in it, they would basically believe in the hereafter, they would believe in it, and they would be committed to their prayer. So what about وَلِتُنذِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا? What about those that don't believe, not in the Quran and what it contains, and not believe in al-akhirah, and they don't believe in it? How would their life be like? That's when the following ayah would explain. The following ayah would explain and say, well, this is going to be their consequence. Their consequence in the hereafter, or at least in their life. Yes, they would say nothing was revealed. They would claim nothing was there. And certainly, one, they are not going to be believing in it. They would not be committed to their prayer. So therefore, the result is going to be that, well, they would be transgressing the limit, because they would be saying, well, there's that this is a lie. This was not at all something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. And certainly they would basically end up in ghamarat al-maut, when in death. But I want you to look at the word ghamarat. What is al-ghamra? Al-ghamra is to be dipped in water. When you say ghamartu shay, it actually means to dip it in water. What happens when you dip something in water? Well, I mean, yeah, you drown it, but why ghamarat al-maut? How is it that death can be a ghamra? When a person is dying, they go through, not everybody, but they go through a moment when they would get all these secretions, and it feels like they're choking. It feels like they're drowning. That's ghamarat al-maut. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us here see that the consequence is that everything is basically in the grip of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that these people, when death comes to them, there's nowhere that they can hide, and that even their death and their breathing is basically in the grip of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, they would have to recognize Qadarullah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if they don't recognize that their life and their death is in the grip of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that their life is determined and ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's what makes them recognize Qadarullah. That's what makes them recognize the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what would make them recognize that there's nowhere but وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ. And those that would believe in al-akhirah, they would believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would believe in the scripture, they would embrace it, they would apply it, and that's basically what Qadarullah, that's what we're putting in. Taqdeer Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's what it mean, what it would mean. It's to basically yu'minuna bil akhirah, they would believe in the hereafter, they would believe in it, they would believe in the blessings, they would believe in the value, they would believe and honor Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how do they honor it? Well, ala salatihim yuhafidhun, they would be committed to their prayer. So this is it. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Let's see. The sister is saying, doesn't it mean a fool's errand? Getting into discussions with them is flogging a dead horse. It should be, actually, isn't it? So, I mean, yes, ذرهم في خوضهم يلعبون. Certainly, I mean, you can, like a flogging a dead horse, certainly that idiom, to actually present it in that way. But it also, I'm here trying to stick to the actual words, because I'm trying to later create, I would say, the vocabulary for the attendees to be able to learn the words and their etymology, and also what, in different places that these words might come into the Quran. I want you, as somebody that learned Arabic later in life, I know how it feels to not understand what the words are saying. So I'm trying as much as I can to help you get to the actual words and what they mean in Lugha Arabiya, to bring about the sensation, to bring about the vision, to bring about that relationship with these words and with these ayat, in order to help you get not only the vision, but the sensation and the meaning and the interpretation. So, inshallah, hopefully you can get the complete embracement for those ayat. That's what I'm trying to get to. Okay, so that's why I tried to get into the words and what they mean in order to bring about all of that taste. Okay, I hope I understand. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Let's see. Our purpose is different. She said this means we divide the Quran. Right. I mean, I did talk about that one. If there are any questions, or if there's anyone that would like to unmute themselves, I'd be happy to listen to. I guess no one wants to be on microphone. I know we passed our